So welcome, everyone. My name is Dale Robertson. I'm with the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and appreciate everyone coming here today, the Van Andel Museum Center and the Meijer Theater, for this special presentation, Making the MexiRican City with Dr. Fernandez. I'd like to just take 1 second here to quickly recognize two of our board members here today, our governing body, the trustees of the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and Marlon Fayan is here, as is Lupe Ramos Montini. So thank you both for being here today. So really, this is part of a series of things that we've actually begun doing. It kind of takes us back to a place that we had been previously, but are really embracing again. And it really all stems from really the core of the museum and what it is. So yeah, we have 250,000 artifacts and specimens by the most conservative count, collected over 169 years. 98% of those artifacts and specimens donated by the people of West Michigan. So when we talk about us being a public entity and a community-based entity, I'm not lying. We are. We are owned to this day by the city of Grand Rapids. So we are truly a public museum, truly owned by all of you here. But the core, really the thing, right, the lesson, the takeaway, what sticks with you from those artifacts and specimens are the stories. Right, the stories that those tell, the stories that you make, stories how your story becomes my story. And so much of it goes back to place. And you see right in the title of this book, Placemaking is right there in the actual title. So this is an opportunity to talk about this place, the narrative that we all create, because it's the narrative by which we all make decisions, if you really just stop and think about it. So this is going to be good. I'm really looking forward to it. And we're going to have a lot of high energy here and some great stories, which then make the narrative. So my story becomes your story becomes my story, and that is how we continue to make community, making the MexiRican City. So with that, please welcome my colleague, Vice President of Human Resources and Legal Counsel, Mary Beth Jelks.
Thank you for you guys coming out. I mean, who would have thought October 1st we'd have 80-degree weather, huh? And between that and the football games and everything, I just really appreciate you being here. And I thank our boss, the CEO, Dale, for really supporting and wanting to do this presentation, because we know how important it is to our city. The introduction is like crazy. She has so many accolades, so I'm gonna nail it down to just a minute and a half. Forgive me, Delia. Dr. Fernandez is an associate history professor at Michigan State University. She was born and raised here in Grand Rapids in the comfort of her tight-knit family, whose history and their roots go back over 70 years. Dr. Fernandez is a first-generation college student who earned a BA degree from Grand Valley State University, I should say, and she got her master's and her PhD. Being a U of M alum, it hurts me to say it, but Ohio State University. So I guess a few good things come out of Ohio State. In addition to publishing 2 award-winning articles on Latinos, the history of Latinos in Michigan, Dr. Fernandez's new groundbreaking work in this book that we're going to have discussion on today and presentation, Making the MexiRican, I love that, MexiRican City, Mexican and Puerto Rican Migration, Activism, and Placemaking in Grand Rapids, Michigan, is what the topic is today. That was published by the University of Illinois in 2023. Her research incorporates extensive primary sources centering on Latino placemaking struggles, triumphs, and narratives in an effort to shape this Midwestern city. the history of Grand Rapids, and this is important. Being married to a historian myself, I can say this. The history of Grand Rapids as we know it prior to Delia publishing this book will never be the same about Grand Rapids. It can never be told, the story of Grand Rapids can never now be told without this component of the narrative. That is, to me, the Latina footprint, right, on our history. The museum is very proud to host this presentation and panel discussion because we believe that, like every other community in Grand Rapids, the Latino community will continue to have significant impact on our city and on our future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Delia Fernandez to the podium.
All right. Does that sound good? Okay. Yep. There it is. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to say appreciation to my folks and everybody who has, the panelists who have supported me, who mentored me, especially La Familia Jelks, Mary Beth, Randall Jelks. If it were not for Randall Jelks' work on African Americans in the Furniture City, I couldn't have conceived that there could be a book on Latinos in Grand Rapids as well. And so I'm here today on, from the support and the mentorship and guidance from a community of people. And I just want to acknowledge that while we're here today. So the first question people always ask is, how did you come up with a book like this? Right, and it comes from deeply personal experiences of not quite understanding my own belonging. So I would leave the Midwest as a MexiRican woman and meet Latinos from New York or from the West Coast who would say, how did that happen? How are you MexiRican? How are you Mexican and Puerto Rican? I thought they didn't like each other. They just didn't get along. And then I would be here in Michigan, where I know I have these deep roots, and people would say, okay, well, where are you really from? And Grand Rapids, well, really, where are you from? Right? Alluding to something that means that I didn't quite actually belong here. People couldn't conceive of me belonging here in the same way they could conceive of themselves. And so on a personal search, something we say in graduate school all the time is research is often research, and that is okay. Right? You can research your community because oftentimes you have information that no one else gets access to. And so that's where I am coming from with this book. So what you'll hear about today is the way that I argue that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans were set on an interrelated and interdependent journey that starts back 100 years, right before so many things even happened, before people started to leave, that brought them to Grand Rapids in the ways that they tried to fit in to a imagined black-white racial binary that the city ascribed to. And the main argument of my book is that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans created pan-ethnic or pan-Latino relationships much earlier than other historians have argued, who look at it as the 1970s as something that was born out of social movements. And I argue that it's really for social connection, for a desire to be able to talk with somebody at work, or to dance at a bar after work, or to have somebody's house to visit after church. And so those connections then served as a base for activism that brought them to fights against the city of Grand Rapids in the realm of city hiring, police brutality, and education to make Grand Rapids a place that they can meet their social, political, and educational needs. So I point to very clearly colonialism, imperialism, racial violence, and economic displacement as factors that made it so that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans could no longer stay in their homes or their places of origin and set them on paths of migration. And so I start in the book covering the War of 1848. And this is in the period of manifest destiny. So this is this idea that Anglo settlers at the time is what they would have been called, had that they had a divine right, that God must have ordained this for them to take over land that indigenous people and other peoples had already lived on in the United States as they moved westward. And this, I point to 1848 as one of these ruptures that creates the instability in people's homelands that make them leave. So after the war, you'll recall, right, big parts of Mexico become the United States. In addition to all of the resources that people, that the United States receives with that land, including copper and gold, livestock, they also get 100,000 people, right? 100,000 people that are living in what was once Mexico and now is the United States. And it's that transition between what was Mexican society and Mexican ways of landowning and property holding, that many, that transition to the U.S. system, that many Mexican landowners lose access to their land. We're going from a system that was in Spanish to a system that's in English, different levels of bureaucracy, and when families can't produce deeds that the U.S. system recognizes, they are displaced, right? White Anglo settlers took over their land, which often set people on a path of wage labor and migratory labor to be able to make ends meet. And then about 50 years later, we see very similar situation in the War of 1898, where this is between the U.S. and Spain officially, but it has massive ramifications for Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and Cuba. And so this is another part of manifest destiny. This is the extension of manifest destiny into imperialism. This war made it so that Puerto Rico essentially went from Spanish power to control by the U.S., making it essentially a colony in which it still functions to this day as a colony of the United States. And in 1898, after that war, the island was then governed by military leaders and business owners. And one of those business owners owned a sugar company, and Puerto Rico grew sugar. So Puerto Rico then, their economy turns to more of a one crop system with all of the energy going into sugar, which has disastrous effects if something happens to that one crop, or if you get competition for that one crop. And in 1917, among other policies towards Puerto Rico, the U.S. also made it so that Puerto Rico's only trading partner could be the United States. It also acquires other places that have that grow sugar, which really devastate this economy. And then lastly, I point to 1910, the Mexican Revolution, that also was one of these instances of rupture where people needed to leave home. So the revolution, the root of it, in short, is that Mexican elites allowed for U.S. and Great Britain to take over lands in Mexico. They sold lands, the lands that were highly valuable. They had oil, they had arable land. The ways that people were making a living before on the land were no longer accessible to them. They were accessible to businesses. And this made it so that a very few people had money and control over their lives and access to land. And so what they would have called peasant farmers, or people who were just farming to sustain themselves or to trade with others, were no longer able to sustain their lives, right, in those places. So that's what caused the revolution, and then the violence from the revolution, including compulsory military draft, made it so that people were leaving in droves over the border at almost 400,000 people in that time period, between 1910 and 1920. And I see that kind of extension of U.S. imperialism in Mexico during the Revolution era as part of economic displacement. But another thing that I take very seriously in trying to uncover the reasons why people would leave is racial violence. Right? So in addition to understanding that people were leaving Mexico to go to Texas, people from Texas, Mexicans who settled in Texas, also leave Texas. Right? Part of this is the migratory labor stream because of without access to land, but the other part is racial violence. And so I think we're more familiar with the narrative of lynching, the lynching of African Americans in the Jim Crow South. That's something that we're taught in our history courses if we're lucky, right? But this also occurred with Mexican Americans in the Southwest. So research by two historians in the book Forgotten Dead explores the rate and what happened behind extralegal violence, or lynchings, as we call them, mob violence, towards Mexicans and Mexican Americans in this time period. And what they know is that the number of people, Mexicans who were lynched in this time period, is about proportionate to the population. Or the rate at which people were lynched was proportionate to the population, as was with African Americans in the South. But one of the things that you can see from these rise in numbers is that they correspond with border interactions. So 51 to 60 is that post Mexican American War period. The 87 to 80 is when we experimented with free trade. With that, when people came back and forth. In 1911 to 1920 is the Revolution years. And so any time that there were interaction at the border, this was something that was happening. One of the other things that these two historians found is that this often corresponded to land border. While Texas and California have the largest populations, it's Texas who has the largest land border. And so that racial violence that existed in Texas, right, is one of the reasons that many people felt unsafe there and took to migration. The other part that I should tell you is that considering that this happened to Mexican Americans in the Southwest and African Americans in the South, this actually tells us, this is more proof that this lynching is not necessarily about a lack of a judicial system or a lack of structure in these areas, but more about how white folks use lynching as a tool to supplant themselves atop racial hierarchies. Right? So there was hierarchies already in the Southwest. Right? Mexicans have their own hierarchies. But as Anglo settlers came in and put themselves atop those after those transition, these lynchings were a way of saying, we hold the power in this society. And the other way that we know that is that a lot of the reasons outside of issues like theft or robbery that people were accused of, as the crime they were accused of, but no one was ever really tried, is that other reasons for lynching Mexican Americans included being of Mexican descent, or courting a white woman, or taking a white man to court, or refusing to plead the fiddle. These things that indicate that there was a societal shift happening and a racial hierarchy that was moving, and folks were willing to enforce it with this type of violence. So I take seriously all of those factors as why people would not stay in their places of origins and why they would be willing to move, right, as a way of survival, as a way of ensuring their futures. I also look at how Mexicans and Puerto Ricans come to West Michigan, and I point to railroad work as one of the main reasons that people are coming, the main type of employment that's available to them. By the late 1800s into the early 1900s, rail work is very synonymous with Mexican laborers and African American laborers. While there had been European Americans building these tracks, and of course Chinese building these tracks, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and many European Americans were gaining access to whiteness, and with that came better and better jobs, leaving Mexican Americans and African Americans to work, to maintenance, and to ride the rails. And so most of the time what I found is that many Mexicans who came to Michigan started in, wherever they started in Mexico, if they got to Zacatecas, the central region in Mexico that has a train stop right there. If you could get there, you then get to Nuevo Laredo, then to Laredo across the border, to San Antonio, and then from San Antonio, you get to Kansas City, and from there to Chicago, where you can essentially go anywhere, right, by this time. And then from Chicago into Grand Rapids. And I also point to, from once you get into Grand Rapids, you really to Chicago, you could go to Grand Rapids, Lansing, Jackson, Detroit, Saginaw, kind of all across lower Michigan in that line, more or less. And I also point to agriculture, right? I look deeply into agriculture because this is one of the main ways that Mexicans and later Puerto Ricans are recruited to come to Michigan. So this I found this is a document from the 1940s from sugar beet growers. a growers association. They were having a meeting talking about labor shortages. And so this is how they thought about Mexicans and their use in labor. The Mexican is considered an ideal sugar beet worker by the sugar beet grower. While considerable effort has been made to encourage the available local worker to do this work, it is doubtful if sufficient qualified labor could be found locally to take care of all the thinning, hoeing, weeding, and topping of the sugar beet. It appears that when the local workers do take these jobs, some of them leave before completing their contract, which may account for the fact that the Mexican field worker is desirable from the grower's point of view. And since the local worker prefers to work in the industrial plants and is able to earn more in that type of work, it is doubtful if a sufficient supply of local or semi-local workers willing to accept the field work jobs could be found. So there's a lot to read into that. Right? So the local worker or the semi-local worker is read as white, right? They're talking about white workers who are living in the thumb region and saying that they are, not actually very good field workers and that they prefer industrial jobs, which makes an assumption that Mexicans don't prefer industrial jobs. They would have loved industrial jobs, but for the most part, they were barred from industrial jobs in this particular time period. They're barred from unions as well. And so many of them, to say that Mexicans were, more likely to do this work because they needed it or they liked it, right, doesn't take into account the societal factors of discrimination that limited their opportunities. And I share this photo of my grandmother's family. So it's my great-grandmother, my grandmother in the corner, and my aunts and my uncle, great-uncle, who were farm laborers in Saginaw. My grandmother was born in Saginaw, as well as many of her siblings, because they were part of that migration that left from Mexico to Texas, from Texas to Michigan. So this is a part of a book called Tejano Diaspora that talks about the movement of Tejanos across the rest of the country for migratory labor. And it's just to show you the places and the kind of reach and the depth that Americans from Texas were going in the first part of a growing season, right? There's parts of the season where they're needed to do particular jobs, planting, right, as opposed to picking and harvesting. And then you can see during the second part, like the movement is going in a lot of different directions, but so much of it is coming to Michigan. At the same time, we also have bracero workers who are coming on 6-month contracts. They're coming directly from Mexico by 1942, well into the 1960s. So we also have Mexican nationals who are sharing fields with Mexican Americans. And by post-World War II, they're sharing fields with Puerto Ricans as well. So I talked about Puerto Rico being a monocrop society by this point, and we got into once we got to the Great Depression, while it was bad here, it was bad in Puerto Rico. It was really bad in Puerto Rico. There were starvation wages, and people were starving due to different environmental factors, but also a failure in policy. By this time, by World War II, island administrators and mainland administrators are saying things like, perhaps Puerto Rico is overpopulated. And that's the problem. And if we move people off the island, there'll be more resources. When in fact, that's flawed, right? That there were enough resources, they were just not distributed, right? They were not distributed in a way that allowed for people to stay on the island, to live full lives there. And so we started sending Puerto Ricans off of the island to help with World War II positions, like in factories and railroads. But by 1950, we also started engaging in agricultural migration, planned agricultural migration. But I want to point out on the two ends here, we have the cover and a page from a booklet that was given to Puerto Rican migrants by the Migration Division, a division of the Puerto Rican government on the mainland. So when migrants arrived to the mainland, they could get one of these booklets that told people about, like, this is what you can expect for winter, or this is what people in the United States eat, for example. But they also say things like, Nueva York no es la única ciudad, that New York isn't the only city, because Puerto Ricans going to New York start to get, they're starting to be stereotyped, right, as poor and here for welfare, not taking into account the colonial conditions that put them on that path, right? And then it says here, right, look, there are groups of Puerto Ricans in cities in California, in Michigan, in Ohio, in Illinois. Go there, basically, is what it's telling them, to spread out, right? And indeed, that's what happened, right? That is what happened. When we took up planned agricultural migration, what was often called airlifts. Michigan, as well as other places, started to recruit workers directly from Puerto Rico. And in 1950, during an acute labor shortage, there were over 5,000 Puerto Ricans who came to Saginaw and across Michigan to be able to help with the labor shortage. And when I mean they were flew in, and not necessarily in a passenger plane, but in an old commando, right? A plane that was used for the military. People were sitting on the floor, shoved into the plane. And there was even an accident in which almost more than half people died. But to tell you how destitute the situation was, for the survivors, only 3 requested to go home, and the others requested to continue to Michigan for these jobs on a bus, right? To just give you an idea of what they were dealing with. And of course, if you read Spanish, you know that these weren't great conditions, right? That this says they describe horrors in the fields of Michigan. Basically saying that once they got there, they found that after working for weeks that they would owe their employer. They were owed for transportation, they were owed for food, they were owed for housing, which were all substandard, right? All substandard housing at the time. And so that this part at the bottom says, this is slavery in the 20th century, underneath the American flag, this symbol of liberty. As Puerto Ricans, they're citizens, and they use that to their advantage. They did leave, they voted with their feet, is what we call it. Many did go to New York, but they also went to Ohio, they went to Lorain, they went to Cleveland and Upper Ohio, they went to Indiana, Northwest Indiana, to Illinois, but they also went to Detroit and to Grand Rapids and other places around the state to try to find better conditions. And so if you can see the places where there's stars, those are places where Puerto Rican workers were and were writing letters to the governor, asking for his intercession, basically saying, like, my wife is expecting a paycheck and they say I owe money and I'm not sure what's going to happen to them if I don't send any money. Can you please check on them? One person wrote the governor asking for the Red Cross to come and get him, right? Likening this to like wartime, right? Wartime situations. Some folks found fields that were not as bad as the others. There's a group of Puerto Ricans who find Lake Odessa as a place where even the Puerto Rican Migration Division that had been investigating all this said, we have not received one complaint from Lake Odessa in this period, which was a very big deal considering the letters that were piling in the 1950s. And so some Puerto Ricans started to make their way west to Lake Odessa and then eventually to Grand Rapids, as did Mexican Americans and Mexicans who were maybe started off in the Thumb region and moved that way. So what did they come into when they came to Grand Rapids? And this part of the book, I talk about the racial binary, that in Grand Rapids, you basically, at this time, if you were white or you were black, and indigenous people were kind of a non-factor in the local hierarchy. And so where did Mexicans and Puerto Ricans as multiracial people, right? They have African, European, indigenous ancestry that marks families very differently, right? Even members of the family look different from one another because of these mixtures. Where did they fit into this binary? And so I started to use a unique record group, jail records, to read across the grain to be able to figure out how people were thinking about them. And this is mostly because there's not a lot of records on Mexicans and Puerto Ricans at this time period. All of the agencies that we might think had looked into poor people, marginalized people, were not paying attention to this group. And so this became an archive that I could read, right? Not for the purpose of understanding necessarily what it was made for. It was made to tell us about an arrest, right? But reading it across the grain, and many of them, gives me a demographic profile of Latinos, Mexicans, and Puerto Ricans that did not exist anywhere else. And one of the things that I could see, right, is the racial composition issue. So this is a Mexican worker, Rosario. He was born in Mexico. That's his nationality. He stayed, his residence, it was in Kansas City. So that ties back to that railroad, right? That railroad trajectory. His offense was larceny of coal. It was a wintertime arrest, which tells me he likely had access to coal, right? As a railroad worker, and that he was cold. Wherever he was living, right? It was probably cold. But the part that really interests me is that on these cards in the 1940s, we took down race of somebody as color. and we also took down complexion. So your color was what we think of as race, and your complexion is literally what you look like. And so while Rosario was marked as white on the reverse side of this, his complexion was simply put as Mexican. Right? So this tells us that whoever was taking the record did not necessarily have a word to describe what they were seeing or to understand where this person fit within the racial hierarchy. Because a complexion, where for white folks it might have said light, or for black folks it said brown or dark brown. But for Mexicans, it started saying things like Mexican, or cinnamon, or chestnut, or all of these things that we might use to describe food or animals, but we had to use to describe people because they didn't understand where these multiracial people fit into the hierarchy. And this was not something that was just in records, but also in the lived experience of people. So this is Irma Garcia Aguilar, a longstanding community member who recorded this interview. This is her elementary school picture about her time as a young person coming to Grand Rapids in the 1950s and 60s. So life was a struggle. Life was hard. I was not white. I was not black. I was other. So it was difficult. There are a lot of parents that would not allow anybody to play with somebody as dark as you. Right? So she was feeling this, right? She felt this on a very personal level. And this was particular to her experience as a racially mixed Mexican-American woman who probably presented as indigenous or mixed indigenous. But for Afro-Latinos or Afro-Puerto Ricans who had African ancestry, their experience was very much like that of Black Americans in Grand Rapids. Meaning they had the same limited opportunities for housing and segregated housing that was happening, including jobs. And so Afro-Latinos reported a sense of isolation because when they were segregated, living next to African Americans, they also did not share a language. So they could not commiserate, right, in a shared language. So while the community also had to deal with colorism, right, amongst itself, they're also dealing with the segregated landscape of Grand Rapids. So I point to the ways that, given all of these obstacles that they had in Grand Rapids in making a home, a lot of these things push them together more or less, right? We still have the issues they have to contend with, but they push them together. And on top of that, these shared experiences with Catholicism, language, other cultural aspects allowed for them to see one another as social equals much earlier than other places. And so I point to the Catholic Church and the Mexican Apostolate that was formed in the 1940s by Mexican and Mexican-American immigrants and migrants who asked the diocese, right, for this formal recognition to have a Mexican ministry, essentially, right, to reach out, to have a place for them within the diocese. And through their own fundraising, they were able to acquire a house, a couple of houses, in fact, but a house to have a chapel, right? The first chapel that would serve Mexicans and then later Puerto Ricans as they came as well. I also talk about, by this time, by the 1950s, by the late 1950s into the mid-1960s, the population that went from about 500 right before World War II, by the 1960s, it is about 5,000. Right, that the community is growing, that Puerto Ricans are also settling, and that they're coming together to make these shared kind of cultural institutions together. So one of which I talk about is the Mexican Patriotic Committee. So this was a committee that, doubled, right? It had played a very important role within the Mexican Apostolate as a mutual aid society that was based inside of the Catholic Church and Catholicism that would help with, anything that you have going on. If you're out of work, they would help with, covering things. If somebody died, they helped to arrange so that people could get back home, to bury folks back home. It was very much similar to a union, but also a social service agency that they had formed on their own. But the other thing that they did was that they were responsible for throwing festivals and parties and these other things that allowed Mexicans and Puerto Ricans to live really full lives, right? That they weren't just, they weren't just laborers, they weren't just segregated into particular parts, that they were finding ways to make this place home. And so when I talked in the beginning about research as me search, that I have information that other people might not have. As I looked at this photo at my parents' house, my parents are here, I'm looking at it as, okay, this is the Mexican Patriotic Committee, big on their computer. And my mom walks by and is like, oh, look, it's Uncle Julio. And just like keeps walking into the kitchen and I'm like, excuse me? Because Uncle Julio is Puerto Rican. And this is a picture of the Mexican Patriotic Committee, right? Julio Vega. And so it was in those small instances that I started to see what was very much a personal history about my Mexican and Puerto Rican roots was actually much wider, right, in the city. And so it made sense that Julio Vega is one of the first Puerto Rican men who likely worked alongside many of these men, right, was also on the Mexican Patriotic Committee because Puerto Ricans were also going to church with Mexicans. It made sense that that could happen. And then in addition, I'd like to point out that if you look very closely behind the shoulders of these men, there are women. There are women, forehead and eyebrows and hair, right? And this was so emblematic of the cultural or the gender dynamics of the community, right? That men would take the leadership position and take the credit, right, for being those in charge who were literally overshadowing the women who actually were responsible for many of the things that made these celebrations a good time to be at, right? So who cooked the food? Who taught the children the dances, the folkloric dances, who sewed the costumes, right? And so oftentimes women, even in the thinking back about their times because of gender dynamics, would not recognize that they valued, right, that they offered value. And so we have oral history participants who talk about Guadalupe Vargas, who's one of community leader, saying, no, it was my husband Daniel who did it. It was Daniel, right? And it's not until somebody else intervenes, a younger relative, who says, you did so much, right? You did the cooking, you did the cleaning. And any time that Daniel Vargas showed up with new migrants, as he often did, right, to the house, who say, oh, they're brand new here, they just got here. It was up to her to find, right, to cook a meal for everybody, but then go through the kids' clothes to see who had outgrown what to offer those to the next family, right? So they could survive. They could survive that winter, right? So there's women performing this labor that make it so that home can happen. And I also found this in the archive in terms of celebrations and festivals. In the early 1970s, there were festivals that celebrated Mexican Independence Day, all of these other religious holidays as well. And this was something I've never seen before. This is a float during the 1971 parade that kind of felt like my whole identity rolled up into one. Because there, as a MexiRican woman, right, I see the streamers of the Mexican flag, right, for this Independence Day parade. But I also see the Puerto Rican flag and the American flag in front of St. Andrew's School, right down there in Sheldon, which they would have took that route right there down to downtown. But the other part is that it's the Fernandez Bar and Float, or bar and restaurant. You can't really see it in there, but that was the restaurant and bar that my grandparents owned, which was the stories that we heard were not necessarily of this type of participation, right, about the bar, but instead what we know as working class folks who had to attend to the bar, I didn't necessarily hear about their activism, but I know from these photos that, right, they were considering themselves a part of their community. They were participating, right? They saw themselves as having a place in these festivals in downtown. And the other way that I look at how MexiRicans, this kind of MexiRican identity forges here in Grand Rapids as it becomes very commonplace, is the forging of Mexican and Puerto Rican unions. Right? So I'll go through a couple of them, but this is Juan Baez and Amelia Silva. Juan Baez is Afro-Puerto Rican. Amelia is Mexican, American. This is them with their family, Amelia's siblings and all of the grandchildren. And it was hard for Juan Baez, who as an Afro-Puerto Rican man was not Amelia's dad's first choice for a partner. Right, in Grand Rapids, right, with the anti-Black sentiment, an Afro-Puerto Rican man would not necessarily mean social mobility for his daughter. Right? Despite that, Carolina, the daughter of of Juan and Amelia, she said, Juan Baez, she always felt like her dad was proving something, and that he took the best care of her mother for almost 50 years until she passed. And that from the grandparents' perspective, or her perspective, or her grandparents, was that she never felt any ill will. She felt very accepted and loved in that family, but was definitely cognizant of the anti-Black sentiment that existed. This is my titi Angelita and my tío Marcial. And so this is Angelita Arazola and Marcial Hernandez. Angelita Arazola is from Gillespie, Texas, and worked with her family on the fields, and is a migrant working family, many children in their family. Marcial Hernandez came with my grandfather and other Puerto Ricans to Lake Odessa. And that's where they had met. They worked and met alongside the field, right? Again, reinforcing this idea that these folks are social equals, that they're allowed to work and live in the same places. All right, so these are the children. I'll just point out, just flash these up here, other parts, other MexiRican couples and their children, because I want to get to the part about activism. Something I spent so much time on the earlier parts, but I really want to get to the part about activism. So by the time we get to the 1970s, the Puerto Rican and Mexican population, along with Cubans who are also coming in at this time, there are about 11,000 Latinos that we have just ballooned in size, and there were not any Spanish-speaking people who worked for the city. Right? So this meant that people who were residents, were paying taxes, were doing all these things, actually did not have access to entitled benefits that they had as residents of the city. That's kind of like in the bigger picture. On the immediate, it also meant that they weren't getting access to unemployment or to welfare or things that they needed to help survive in Grand Rapids at that time. And they knew this, activists knew this, and they put pressure right on the city government. And given the conservative nature of West Michigan, this was very difficult to do, that even when the press wrote about this, they still cannot quite fess up to what's going on, right? Because if you read that headline and you're like, is that a double negative? Like, does that make quite sense? That the city job policy found not fully unbiased, right? Just a little bit, right? Like, it's biased, right? That we actually do have a bias in hiring, and that this was no secret to anybody, right? Who was on the receiving end of not getting a job within the city, right? They knew that already. And so Latinos using Model City funds, War on Poverty funding, were able to craft the Latin American Council, a one-stop shop for social services, cultural awareness, and a base for activism. So given that there were limited access to the social services provided by the city, they created their own unemployment situation. So this started as one person calling around to see who would hire and see if they would hire Latinos. They did well baby checkups there. They did elderly services, Alcoholic Anonymous. They did English classes. Sometimes, the director would open up his desk and that became an examining table, right? That this was on Granville, on Pleasant later, as a place where Latinos could get the services they needed. They also were the base for cultural awareness. This one talks about how they were able to make a library, right? Because there was at our libraries, we didn't have any content on Latinos. In the school districts, we didn't have any positive content on Latinos at the time, very limited amount of Latino teachers as well. And so they started to create cultural awareness programs from babies to the elderly. But what I really wanted to mention was that this fight for police jobs, and what it really is a fight against police brutality. Was what was happening in the 1960s from when Mexican Americans first got there, right, into the 70s, that they would have encounters with the police that ended in an incident of brutality or violence, and the police would say it's a language issue. But these were also happening to Black folks who spoke English, right? So we knew it wasn't necessarily a language issue. That instead, perhaps the policy that was there, right, was a problem. But again, given West Michigan and the conservative nature of the city, while other places in LA or Chicago might have been asking for an abolition of the police or a restructuring of the police from the bottom up, in Grand Rapids, activists knew that the best they could probably do was get more Black and Latino police officers hired under the flawed assumption that more people from their neighborhood, people policing them, if they were from their neighborhood, they would be less likely to face violence. When in fact this might be a policy issue and not necessarily a personnel issue. So as Latinos joined Black Grand Rapidians in this shared fight together, while they had some issues that brought them apart, this is one that brought them together. They demanded these police jobs and they received a lot of pushback A lot of resistance from everyday Grand Rapidians who are writing into the newspaper, saying that this was reverse racism, saying that these people did not deserve this, saying that if they don't want to be police, then don't give them fire access either, fire department access, right? These just really things that revealed the way they saw these groups. And the Fraternal Order of Police was one of the most staunch, right, resistors that had said, you know, if we do this, we'll have to make a plan for the Japanese, we'll have to make a hiring plan for the Japanese, for the Dutch, for the Polish, and named off all these groups, not realizing that, in fact, those were the people who had the jobs to begin with, right? Bar the Japanese, right? Wasn't allowed. So instead of continuing to attack the police department and the hiring, given the retrenched racism that existed in the rhetoric of policing, right? Because policing came with power, they decided to go and to challenge the fire department, which in some places, in some cities, did have that political power. But in Grand Rapids, that was not necessarily the case. And so 2 Vietnam veterans, a Mexican-American man, Pablo Martinez, and James B. Ragsdale, right, an African-American man, went and joined in suit against the city of Grand Rapids. And in actuality, they were taking aim at the civil service exam that they charged did not actually predict job success, right, which was a very tried and true strategy of the 1970s in terms of getting access to state, local government jobs, right? This did not get as much, right? Did not get as much resistance from the public. And in fact, the city agreed to a consent decree basically saying, you know, we're not going to necessarily say we did anything wrong, but this is what we can do in the future, which included hiring programs, validating the test. Up until this point, they had been saying, you know, the police department had been sending white officers to Grand Valley to learn Spanish and take Black history. They were like, if you can do that, you can help get these Black and Latino and indigenous candidates through the test. You can spend that money on, you know, giving them the proper training they need, as well as taking down some of the more prohibitive requirements to being a police officer that didn't actually fit the job. So there's Pablo Martinez and James Ragsdale. And Pablo will tell you as well, like Pablo went on to have this wonderful 30+ year career as a fire inspector, the first only Latino that I know of until this day. But it took Pablo at least 8 years before he became a firefighter, because he got word from the inside that these fellow firefighters would not protect him because of the kind of trouble that he had been causing, right, to show that. And I don't actually know what happened to James B. Ragsdale. And following up with records, I can't quite see that. And then lastly in the book, I talk about education. I talk about, so this headline, right, that shows that only half of Latin Americans were going to graduate that year, when actually in previous year, it had been up to 69% were not graduating, right? So only 1/3, 1 out of 3 Latinos in this time period were graduating high school. And so I look at this as a push-out rate, because many parents were asking for, parents and students alike, biliterate and bicultural education that put their communities in the positive light that they knew existed, and not kind of these textbooks that showed that they had deficits, right? But without, you know, there was no Latino school teachers, maybe a couple, 2 or 3, up to 6 at one year, but they didn't necessarily stay. Paraprofessionals were one way that we were able to get Latina faces into classrooms, because all of this was signaling you don't belong. You don't belong in school. But one of the ways that I look at is that they solve this issue is through the creation of the Neighborhood Education Center. And this is Carmen Fite. She's actually a trained cosmetologist from New York City who moved to Grand Rapids with her husband, did not have any children at the time, and started to volunteer in the schools to meet other women, right, to meet other Latinas. And ended up becoming basically an education activist, and worked with the state level administrators, Black state level administrators, to apply for the Neighborhood Education Authority, a program that gave money to create schools that are community run, which is something very unique, which we can talk about also later. But they created this center that created the bicultural, biliterate, the programming that students needed to succeed. This is one of the murals that the students helped to create with Jose Narezo. This is on Granville Avenue. It doesn't look like it's in this good a shape anymore, but this was one of these other very public ways of claiming space and talking about their shared, Latino identity in the 1970s. It fits very much with the 1970s social movement aspect, where we have flags, we have the Black Power fist, the symbol for women, indigenous, a depiction of an indigenous person, gesturing to indigeneity again with the Aztec symbol of the sun, but also to working class peoples, right? To working class, to farm workers. And I end the book talking about gentrification on Granville Avenue and thinking about gentrification as a threat to the placemaking, the undoing of placemaking after 70 years of placemaking in that neighborhood and among others. And this is a mural by the Cultura Collective that they made in 2018, a youth-based arts program in very much in an affirmative way of claiming space, among other projects that they've done. But what I love about this particular picture is the acknowledgement in that the last 40 years, the amount of Latinos has grown and changed from where they were coming from, but also in gesturing towards Latino futurities, our belonging in this space in years and decades to come. We have Latinos in books, children, right, in books, and thinking about our future. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia. And in the interest of time, have a seat. I'm going to tell you all to put on your sunglasses with all the star power on this panel. We have our moderator, Guillermo Cisneros. Will you come on up? He is the president and CEO of West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. They're doing phenomenal things. We have Melinda Ysasi, the first Latina city commissioner of the Second Ward. History making, all kinds of awards these people have. Carlos Sanchez, who has been a community leader, and I believe he was once the president of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. So, I mean, it's just phenomenal. We have Christina Arnold. I didn't mention what Carlos is executive director of Casa Latina Davenport, all programs at Davenport University. We have Christina Arnold, who is the former founder and executive director of the Bob and Alecia Woodrick Center for Equity and Inclusion at GRCC. And then we have Marti Cotto Hernández, who is the president of the Puerto Rican Cultural Committee of West Michigan. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
And you can have at it.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
How is everyone doing this afternoon? Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Delia Fernandez, for an amazing presentation and also for this publication. I love history. Personally, so it's always great when I can learn about my community, where my people came from, and I believe this gives us incredible tools, to be able to speak about who we are, what is our trajectory as Latinos, the value that we have, in this community. And I just love, that piece, that history is different now. This is not the same, as it was even 20 years ago. We have a different community. We continue to grow. We continue to bring development, to bring investment, to create businesses, as Latinos. So I am very excited of this work. So thank you so much. And thank you for the incredible panelists that we have this evening. I want to start in this evening with some questions. I think it's going to be a rich conversation. So I'm going to ask a question, and you can just pitch in. Do you think that these historical survival tactics or strategies of the Latino pioneers in Grand Rapids in the last 100 years are still relevant for today in the Latino Hispanic community?
I can go ahead and start. I think watching all of this was so moving and trying not to cry because My family was one of 12 families that came from South Texas, Mexico, who knows exactly where, in 1947. Great-grandparents who held the masses in their homes before the capilla was built. And then seeing some of those things now, being on city commission and being on the civil service board and recognizing that that wasn't that long ago. So yes, thank you. Also proud Grand Valley Laker, go Lakers, Dr. Fernandez. And it's great to be up here because I went to school with Delia's brother. And so I'm like, she just was like here. She's like here doing all this great stuff. And you know, I think the one thing that I will say that strikes me as what, you know, sort of we have to do the same, or that appears as a pattern, is this idea of mutual aid. You know, this mutual aid society that Dr. Fernandez mentioned, this was sort of in the mid to late 1940s here in Grand Rapids. My dad would talk about, you know, Chris's grandpa driving them around and teaching people how to drive and so many other things that you'll read in the book. And then I think about some of the work that happened during COVID as it related to, you know, helping those who were undocumented, who didn't have access to the traditional sort of government benefits that were existing, like the surplus, what were the subsidies, or what were they called? Now I forget.
The government access to like title benefits and things like that.
Yeah, so all of those benefits that weren't available at that time, we saw that just during COVID present itself again, that we needed to create these mutual societies. And we see it happening even, you know, in other smaller ways, part of our Latina network, trying to help people access jobs, connect to different pieces. The program that Carlos founded, Líderes, which is, you know, a training program, but it also is also connected to building your social capital. And I think those folks that started that mutual society at that time didn't, you know, they were doing it out of, you know, this person is like me, or this person could be like me. I could need that help in the fact. So that is the one thing that strikes me as sort of repeating itself in our community.
Thank you for mentioning Líderes. Yes, one of the things that I, well, first of all, I used to say that I am really not, when I was at the Hispanic Chamber, I was really not prepared, or I felt uncomfortable talking about the Latino community here in West Michigan and Grand Rapids, because I wasn't born here, right? However, now I've been here for about a quarter of a century, so I have some history now. There is one thing that it was relevant. Those years has been relevant. Yet today it is activism. It's just that there might be different ways in which we are activists, right? I've told dear friends of mine, you might not see me demonstrating on the street next to you. That is not how I do activism. But I will be talking to other folks. I will be in different venues. I will be talking to different people, right? So as long as we all keep working towards the same goal in unison and in communication, that part of that activity or that way of moving forward, it continues to be relevant.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I know Mindy mentioned it was hard not to get emotional with, you know, when you think about the history. Yeah, so my grandparents were actually one of the first families to settle in the area. So I grew up watching them, you know, helping people, people lining up outside their door. My grandfather would translate and take them to get their driver's license, including Maggie from Maggie's Kitchen. He took her. And so a lot of the history that I hear from individuals that, you know, some of it I don't remember being young, but being younger. But I think that it's definitely relevant today, is that need for support and help and activism, because back then there weren't that many of us in the community, where now there's so, you know, I don't even know what the population is. At 16% here?
16%.
Yeah, so that's huge, that's significant, but the opportunities aren't there for many of us, nor are we reflected based on our demographics and leadership roles and so forth. And the need for the support for for undocumented individuals wasn't as, relevant back then as it is now. So the support services and so forth are so important. And I do want to mention the Latina Network, how significant that's been, because when I was growing up, I was one of a few, where now it's like there's so many of us that are there and that are professionals that have gone on to college and so forth. And now, we can support each other. We can, we can mentor each other and help each other, and just how important that is for individuals to have the role models and support to, and networks to be able to continue on their leadership journeys. So definitely, I think that the support services are so much needed.
Hello. I'm a transplant. I'm from Defiance, Ohio, and I came to Grand Rapids in '72 as a teenager, and I stayed here. And there were hardly a lot of Puerto Ricans and hardly a lot of Mexicans at that time. I have seen the population extremely grow in the past 50 years that I've been here, to the point that I know the services that were offered there. Even we have grown as a Hispanic community, but I still think that we're still in the same plot with services that need to be happening for the Hispanic community. I come from the field of education, and I remember when there was a lot more Hispanic teachers and administrators in the district, and now I see less. And so that we are struggling if we want to educate our kids and get them where they need to be. I think that we need to look at the services that are being offered for the parents in health, a lot in health, but in just social services. And I just see that there's a need and there's some relevance. And I also see this, I come from Defiance, Ohio, so I'm an Ohio person. But I still have family that has graduated from state and the U of M. So I just want to express that I really think that we just need to be out there and try to know who we are in the community and what services are needed.
And thank you. And I want to really add the value, that we all, bring, to this community. Our different Latino organizations that were mentioned, Líderes, Latina Network, the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Here it's my friend and the board member, Tony Baker. He's a PhD. A few years ago, he sent me 2 articles about the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. So in 1981, and these are in the archives of the Grand Rapids Public Library. In 1981, Don Francisco Vega, which was the owner of the cemetery, said, well, Latinos are growing here in West Michigan. In Grand Rapids, we need to create a Hispanic chamber that represents us as Latinos because our voices are not being heard. There was a big splash, it was in the news, 1981. After the splash, nothing happened. In 1992, 11 years after, another group of Latinos workers for the city of Grand Rapids were very upset because the Grand Rapids Chamber at that time was bringing the World Trade Center. Or the World Trade Center was coming to the city. Non-Latinos were invited, to those, meetings. And they said, we need a Hispanic chamber that represents us and brings our voices, because we are not being heard, we are not even being invited. They started another Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, didn't work out. 10 years after, another group of Latinos back in 2003 said, and these were 3 Latino business owners right on Division and Burton, where the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce is currently, said, we need a Hispanic organization that represents the voices of the Latino business community. Fine, and the chamber that I have the honor to lead was incorporated in 2004, and has the goal to increase the economic advancement of Latino-owned businesses and support the professional growth of Latinos. It took us, so today is 2023. How many years are there from 1981 to 2023? Took us 42 years as Latinos to get to where we are at and to have a voice that represents us in the business, sphere. So this takes time, but we need to make sure that we continue to organize ourselves, and continue to represent well and recognize that all of us should have a voice in this community. So, and I get passionate about these pieces. So I'm going to continue to ask the questions here. So, given the Latino Hispanic community is so diverse, with Mexican, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Spanish, and other geo groups, how do those differences play out today, both positive and negative?
Well, I'm just going to speak from the educational point of view, because as an administrator in the school, you see the families that are enrolling into the system. And the Mexicans have always been here, and the Puerto Rican community was growing at the same time, with families coming in to work in Grand Rapids. Then there was a growing population of Dominicans that were coming in the 70s that I remember very clearly, because some of our educators, I don't know if you Mr. Peña, Ms. Moreta, we had those people that were Dominicans that coming back from that background, and we didn't have a lot of Puerto Ricans. I think that more of us were in the teacher aide position. But the people that were coming in to the school, I can tell where the population was growing, and lately it has been the Guatemalan community. Guatemalan community is growing very strong, and they need a voice in this community too. So I just think that one of the things that it needs to play out here is that we still don't even know amongst ourselves, and especially when non-whites, don't know the difference between a Mexican, a Puerto Rican, and a Dominican. Like I went to the bank and some guy said, well, I don't understand what's the difference between a Mexican and a Puerto Rican. I said, there is a difference. Our food is different. We speak a different accent with a different accent. And he says, well, what food do you eat? He didn't even know. And I said, well, this is you talk about enchiladas, burritos, and you talk about tacos. And Caribbean people eat rice and beans. Rice and beans. If you go wherever you go to Dominican, Puerto Rico, hasta los cubanos that we say, we all eat a variety of the same food. And we're not all Mexican. There is a culture in this country, especially in this city, has grown with different populations. And we are not even conscious of that yet. So I think that's a negative, that we need to be more inclusive with ourselves and our activities and make sure that we all have a voice. Okay, and a voice for me is a vote. If you can vote, you have a voice.
I'll just say, having, been born and raised here, and, lived here my whole life and have seen, the population grown. On the negative side, just kind of going with what Marty had said, is that we're all put into one category, like, oh, you're all Hispanic, and it's like, no, we may be all Hispanic, but we're not all the same. So I think that a lot of what you said, Marty, is so true, is that just, categorizing us all as the same, when there's so much richness with all the other cultures. So I think, on the positive side, it's just amazing to have all the rich cultures, and I've learned so much being part of the Latina network, because we are predominantly the Mexican population is the highest population, but just learning about, the Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, all of the, the richness of the other individuals as well. So I think that that's a real positive, but a lot of people don't understand their stories, you know, within all of us. And so not all Mexicans are the same. We don't all, you know, when I was growing up in a time, and Marty can probably relate to this, it was like speak English, speak English. My mom had to go to the schools and fight because they wanted to put us in special ed back then, just because we were Mexican. And so, you know, I'm not bilingual. And so I've been told before, like, you should be ashamed, you don't speak Spanish, that kind of thing. But that's how I grew up, where now it's cool to know language, and it's, you know, it's a different time. So generational as well, you know, we're all different. You know, I'm second generation here, and, you know, again, we were one of 2 Mexican families in our school when I was growing up, so I had to assimilate, you know, so there's a lot of, where now I'm very proud of my culture and heritage, where when I was growing up, there weren't that many people that looked like me, so it was really challenging to kind of, who are you? And I know you mentioned being asked. I mean, I grew up in a time where it was, where are you from, or what are you? Are you Polynesian? Are you this or that? You know, I mean, I used to get that in school all the time, you know. So, and I still have gotten it, even, you know, recently, like, well, where are you from? But where are you really from? So it's like, you know, hey, I was born and raised here, and a lot of people don't believe that I was born here. So I was born in Butterworth Hospital.
May I add, I think there are also, people don't understand, Puerto Ricans did migrate north, like ¿cómo se dice? Delia. Delia said, my father came up from Puerto Rico to work in the foundries in Ohio. That's how we came here. And then we worked, my mother and the 5 of us kids out of the 8, migrated, do immigrant work and pick tomatoes, and we went up and lived for every 3 summers up in Traverse City, Lake Leland, out picking cherries. Did that. So when I came home back from school, they would ask, so what did you do for your summer vacation? You know, pick cherries, you know. But it is everybody has a story, and a beautiful story that needs to be told of how we came to be. All these ladies, I don't know you, but Delia, I know from the Fernandezes, and Ysasi, I went to, worked as a teacher with her dad, you know, and she babysat my kids, you know. So we have a history here, and a beautiful history. And I think that's a positive, because we all came together. But I think it all came through education.
I'll just say two things about the diversity. Of course, there's enormous diversity within the Latino culture, right? Of course. So when I find myself in places where we start talking about the differences between us, I say, yeah, that's fine, we're different, but let's rather talk about the similarities, right? And how can we work together? So that is one. The second piece is that last time I heard, I think it was about 80% of the Latino population in West Michigan was of Mexican descent.
87.
87. So sometimes what happens is that any Latino, Hispanic fill in the blank becomes a Mexican fill in the blank, like event, talk, whatever. So if that is the case, I think it's an opportunity, it's a responsibility, let's say, for myself to make sure that as much as possible, it is, I mean, if it's not an actual Mexican thing, to make it as diverse as possible, right? And I will be the first one to say, I don't know that many Puerto Ricans or Dominicans, etc., but I know one. Can you introduce me to more, right? Or because they, again, so you utilize our network to make it actually a diverse, fill in the blank event, party, whatever. So.
I'll just add, I think, yes, all of those pieces. Yeah, Marty's daughter used to walk me to school and get me a donut at Old Elder Elementary. And so there is this deep, deep history. We have been part of these communities. You saw that call. I went to school with Pablo Martinez's son at Catholic Central. Like, so not, I think we'll just keep hitting that it's not so far removed from this. But I think the positive is yes. You know, fried plantains, love them. Why don't we have those as Mexicans? You know, that's one thing I would say. You know, when we talk about culture, that very top point is the food, flags, and fun. Now that's great, and that's usually how you get people in. The deeper part is, what is the collective power that we're willing to build together? And I think that's where many of us, as we're maybe sharing a drink or sharing a taco, or we were eating some menudo this morning, that's the real question for us. We have this, I think, care and consideration. There's been marriages, there's been working together. But in Delia's book, you know, it's really great to be a footnote to say that only in 2019 was I elected as the first Latino identity to the city commission. In 2013, Sunita Lanier was elected as the first Black woman. And so when we think about these racial identities, Black, Latina, my nieces and nephews are growing up as multiracial children, Black, white, and Latino. And I want them to know all of their parts of their communities and heritages. And so I think that's what's missing for me is, yes, it is great to be the first, but who's going to be the fifth? Who's going to be the 10th? Who's going to be the 15th? And how will we take that not only to the city level, but to the state legislature? We don't see that here on this side of the state. We just added we now have 5 positions on state legislature here in Grand Rapids that needs to be changed. You know, we went through redistricting. So I think what, you know, Marti said around that representation as the vote is we have this huge opportunity to continue to grow our political power. And we also need to recognize that not all Latinos, you know, sort of believe the same things from a political perspective. But I always say that, you know, Latinos want the same things that anybody else who is non-Latino in this community, in this building want. We want safe schools. We want the ability to buy a home. We want the ability to get education at an affordable rate. We want our children to do better than we have done. What the difference is that there's different structural barriers that we need to be aware of, and how do we address that, either for a language piece, you know, systemic racism piece, and some of those other, you know, colonial aspects that Dr. Fernandez brought up.
Yeah, thank you. I you know, really like what Carlos, you know, said, you know, when he started the piece, you know, when we hear or I'm part of conversations that, you know, we are different. Well, let's not focus on the differences. You know, we are all the same. You know, and at the West Michigan Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, we have a program. We work with Latino college students called Building Bridges for Education. I just don't perceive this, you know, very prevalent in the new generations. You know, these new generations of Latinos, they don't care if they are Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, you know, they are completely integrated, you know. So it is fascinating that this happened, you know, with the previous generations. But now, you know, I seriously feel that we are more in tune with our, you know, really Latinidad, you know, and we don't pay much attention to the pieces, you know, of which country you are part of. At the Hispanic Chamber, at some point we had 3 Dominicans, 3 Mexicans, now we have 1 Venezuelan, you know, so it is beautiful to see all of the ethnicities, not ethnicities, but the different countries that we have in this region. So we have lots of opportunities to continue to come together as Latinos, and we're getting there more and more.
Can I just say, we do have a lot of opportunity, but as a city and community, we have to be more inclusive with opportunities because we're losing so many of our young people. Mm-hmm. I mean, just my daughter went on for her bachelor's and, you know, her master's, which would have been a dream for my grandparents to see, that she went to U of M and then to Columbia. She's in New York now. She has no desire to come back to Grand Rapids. She lives in Brooklyn. Her neighborhood is primarily Dominican, and it's, like you said, it doesn't matter who you are. It's just the richness of having that community. And that's what I see so many of our young people leaving, or we can attract young professionals, but we can't retain them. And so that to me is just very disheartening, because we still are very much a community that is not inclusive and representative of all. So.
And Christina, this is a problem that we have as a state. As the state of Michigan is losing population as we speak, and this is something that our current government is trying to figure out, on how to not just attract but retain people, and in my opinion, it's about investing, in the community that we have here. We don't have a pipeline to produce Latino engineers or Latino doctors currently because our kids at GRPS have never been invested in physics and math. Our Latinos right now, when they get to middle school, they are not interested because they are weak in STEM, physics and math. And this is a conversation that many of us are having, we need investment in our Latino community, in our Black community, so we can have we can create different pipelines and they stay here in West Michigan. Obviously, we're creating all kinds of, pipelines, or we want to create pipelines. We have the medical mile right now in many pieces. But how are we paying attention? Attraction, it's awesome. We need to attract others. But how are we paying attention to our local communities? How are we investing in them? So I completely agree with you, 100%. We have an issue with retaining people. And it's in my opinion, it's about development of what we currently have, in this region that has never been paid attention.
Yeah, but I also do want to say though, that we've been talking about that for years, and I always say that there's a warehouse full of flip chart paper that, okay, we're bringing in consultants, we're doing this, we're doing that, but we're not really doing it. So yeah, I have seen some movement, but again, not to reflect the demographics of our community. So, and it's more than just educating them, because a lot of our young people are being educated, but then they're going off to other places because they don't feel a real sense of community here in our community. So that is really
yes, important. Yeah. I was about to leave, Christina.
What?
I was about to leave West Michigan after 3 years of being here, not finding my community, my opportunities.
So if we want to be this rich, vibrant community, we have to be inclusive for all people and have the opportunities for all people.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of our Black and brown people, it's hard to be what you can't see. Yes, now we have, I want to say Mindy, you're always going to be Mindy to me. Mindy, at the City Commission, we have our attorneys like Raquel, we have all these amazing, leaders, but it's like, now the next generations can see see the potential and opportunities.
Absolutely. So what is the biggest misconception about the Latino Hispanic community by other population groups in Grand Rapids?
I think some of it was said, so I'll just restate this really briefly, because I'm trying to look at Mary Beth to be like, getting the head nod, because I want to get my book.
Yes.
Is one of the whole reasons that we started the Latina Network back almost 10 years ago now is because there were some of us, and I'm sure there were other pockets of individuals who were, but it was myself and two other friends, or three other friends, who felt like we kept being asked to serve on boards. We need a Latina, we need, essentially felt like checking the box. And we were like so exhausted by that ask that we cannot be the only ones. And if we are the only ones, we need to be, or we know we're not the only ones, so how do we connect? And so Latina Network was created to shape a different narrative of what it means to be Latina. A recognition, again, that we are not all Mexican, we all don't speak Spanish, that we all, I'm child-free by choice, so, sometimes there's a lot of maternal identity put into that Latina identity, that we all work in different areas and that we sort of want to be able to foster that. Again, I grew up with a family rich in education. It looked like a really hard job. Never wanted to be a teacher, had to clean books in the summers, didn't do as much research, like the business classes. And so this realization that we are not a monolith is just like the number one thing that I think all of us have said. I think the other misconception I would say is that Latinos have just arrived here in the city, right? I think that is a very common misconception for some people. But if you look at Dr. Fernandez's research, you will see that the history is so deep. And there were so many firsts, and that, I think when I read the book, I some of the clippings, I think, came from my grandma, but also reading the book about this whole statewide, what is the presence of Latinos in the state? So I would say those are the two, that we're a monolith, we're all the same, and that we've just arrived in this community and don't have such a long history of being here in this Midwest city.
I'll say that. I mean, I cannot overstress anymore the fact that we are not a monolith. What I would actually say, though, is that we need to be careful ourselves in our Latino community when groups play to that monolithic, right? So somebody would say, but Latinos are really, really religious. So there's a reason why they want us to, right? No, I am not, right? But they really care about family and kids. Well, some of us don't have kids, right? I mean, there's always a group that tries to play to that idea of we're all the same. So we gotta be attent. Why is that? There is a reason why they want to put us like everybody on the same, all of us in the same box, right? Whatever that box is. Again, it's always because someone has other intentions.
But every culture, every nationality has their celebrations and pride that they share. And so for the Puerto Ricans, we need to be included in things that are happening in the city because we are U.S. citizens, and we're entitled to those kinds of services. And I just think that when we don't acknowledge other cultures within the heritage of this growing city, that we're neglecting them. The Dominicans have been here since the 1970s, and I remember one time when they were celebrating, I used to go to their celebrations of February 27 was their Independence Day. Big event. But the population started dying out and those things were not celebrated. When you don't celebrate your culture, you lose it. Your kids lose it. They forget how to speak Spanish. They forget, can't cook the meals anymore. I think that's what's important here is that we don't forget and we celebrate and it's, I think it's the thing that we need to be doing as a city.
Absolutely. Do we have time for one last question?
Yeah, one last question.
Okay, perfect. With the significant population growth and demographic changes, how do you see the Latino Hispanic population becoming more impactful in the local public policy arena?
It doesn't happen just because, right? I mean, when I was in Hispanic Chamber, people say there are a lot of Latinos. So eventually, Latinos will become this and will have the power, as if it was just a natural progression. It doesn't happen that way, right? It happens because we actually do it. Because people like Mindy run for office, right? It's because you go to the state and you talk to the governor, right? It's because you educate our kids, right? It doesn't just happen. So we actually need to, every single day, we gotta get up and do it and work at it. And I would like to underscore, it happens because of books like yours, right? You're absolutely right what you said. The history of the Latino community will not be the same anymore, right? Because there's one book. Like when you think of it, like, God, there's only one? Yeah, there is only one. Like, we got it right more so.
I think we just have to work on collaborating more and supporting each other when we have the opportunities to run for public office and different things. I mean, again, we don't all believe the same, but as much as we can support and advocate for each other, that means a lot. And then we can come together and you know, what we want and what we want to see for our future is the collaboration is really important, and, you know, agree to disagree, but let's support each other. That's the only way, you know, we're gonna see some change and not be so territorial about certain things or that certain groups own this or that's them. And, you know, we have to come together.
I really think it starts with education, starting young, teaching them. The schools need to I know that we need to have minority teachers in the classroom. I never had a minority teacher in my whole 12 years of education. And that was important when I was in Ohio. But it's important to have those people of color involved in the education of the students so that they can grow up and be productive citizens.
I'll just say, public policy, I think is, we saw it in the presentation. Pablo Martinez, I know I'm forgetting the other gentleman's name.
James Rex, though.
James. And they fought something that seems like a huge institution that at that time, that I think today people would be afraid to do. And so that was, in the mid 70s. And so that's how policy changes. I see our Deputy Chief Freeman here in the audience. You got your uniform on, so I got to call you out. We've had a lot of those first. But I also think the other piece of public policy is to continue to disaggregate information that we see, particularly around areas around housing, which we know, pretty much almost all the country is in a significant housing crisis. So when we look at, again, we saw that during COVID, where we knew more Latinos had more individuals in households due to a variety of, the racial income gap, due to just overall, not a lot of transfer of wealth. And so that's why we saw those higher rates of, COVID in the Latino and Black populations. And so I think we have to continue to disaggregate that data. We have to keep asking ourselves, how do we build up political power? So some of that through gerrymandering that hopefully is maybe getting taken care of here in the state of Michigan. And then, lastly is to remember that public policy isn't just for those who like politics or for those who want to come to hear a wonderful speaker on a Sunday afternoon. It is impacting every single one of us every single day. The minute we wake up, when we get in our car, are we able to drive? Can we purchase that home? Can we get into a bank? And just don't talk about it as something that doesn't impact us, but make it, sort of that real life scenario that impacts us all.
Outstanding. Thank you all so much. I will, in the interest of time, allow for 2 public audience questions if you have. Dr. Fernandez or the panelists, and then we'll close it out with final remarks.
Yes.
From you.
Yeah.
Do we have 2 questions, 1 or 2 questions? Does anybody have?
Oh, sorry.
Deputy Chief and Dr. Jones.
This is less a question than a statement. The slide that you had where the women were in the back of the men was a powerful one. So I'm very appreciative of seeing the Latinas here standing up front. I understand the benefit of having strong African American women in the family, in the congregation, in the community. And to see you up here on part of this panel, I love the makeup of it. So I really appreciate you all being here and taking that front role.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, Dr. Fernandez-Jones, but the one question I do have, and it seems that it was omitted, is that we still have a crisis of immigration, and the Braceros Act was as controversial then, but we are now don't even have that kind of policy going on, and the kind of changing dynamics of by the MexiRican City when it was small, now large. So could you just, Dr. Fernandez, could you just give us some observations about the crisis on the Tejano border? And since that's the longest border,
Yeah, and I think there is this, I'd like to connect it to Michigan too, because I think that we play a very interesting role in the aftermath of the Trump administration's policies, and with many of these policies have not been rolled back. And so we're living with these, the separation policies. We are seeing the direct results of that here in Michigan. I know many of you hopefully have seen the article that was out a couple of months ago about many of the Central American youth who are working in our factories, right? And that this was an educator who blew the whistle on this, right? That shows us this importance. We were not alone, of course, right? That there were these other cities that were being called out for this, but that we were included in this tells us even more, right, about the policies, the ramifications of these policies, that we have not come to a place where undocumented immigrants, children, their families can find safety, right, in our city, that they are prone to exploitation from the systems that of capitalism that require that their caretakers needed them to contribute, that allowed for those children to work in those particular facilities. And so I think that in as many of the panelists have said, that we actually still have a very long way to go in considering how we bring into the fold the most marginalized within the Latino community.
Well, we're going to close out on that just in the interest of time, because those of you who haven't been able to purchase Dr. Fernandez's book, they are out there. We want to give time for that. We thank all of you all. It's a sacrifice given your busy schedules to come, and we do appreciate the discussion. We absolutely appreciate the
Thank you for having me.
that you've done, and let's give everybody a good applause.